On this episode of Locked On Lightning, today we start player reviews. And first up, Nick Paul.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150. With any winning $5 bet, visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. On this episode, we're starting off our series of player reviews, and first off on the list is none other than Nick Paul. But before we grab and talk about that whole raveling of a bag, we got to talk about that. We want to remind you to go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are should be in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification button, and as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be able to notify it. That's how cool that is. And drop a comment below. Let me know what your thoughts, questions, concerns may have been about Nick Paul this season, about his season. So we're looking, I always like doing player reviews. And I would have thought, usually we start off with the big guns. I think last year probably did Kucherov first. And then we did Stamkos, Hedman, Point, and yeah, it was a little while before we went into Nick Paul, but I thought it was pretty cool. I thought it would have been a cool idea to kind of start off with Nick Paul, save those other top names for later on, maybe really jump into the nitty grittiness of this Lightning team. And I'll start off by saying about my thoughts about Nick Paul is that every year he has been here for Tampa, he has really impressed me. This was his third season with Tampa Bay, his second full one. And he's one of those players that I think we could agree when we look at the player, when we do the eye test, even if you're watching every single game, as a lot of us do, it's to a certain extent almost shocking when you see his numbers, how good they are. Because, and I've probably used this terminology to really describe his game before, but he has just such an unassuming presence about him. And that's not in any negative way towards him, or it doesn't say anything negative about him. It's actually the opposite. I think that really it's just, he's not one of those players that is really going to wow you with anything he does. I mean, obviously his performance, but I mean, he is not going to do anything really remotely highlight worthy that we are going to see on NHL Face-Off the next morning. And that really works well for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So just to summarize, this past season, he played 82 games. Always glad to see a player play a full season. 24 goals and 46 points. Just a little heads up for this player review as well as going forward. I'm not going to place a big emphasis on plus minuses. Even for the defenseman, I'm really not going to really make a big deal out of that. We already know what the deal is with this Lightning team. The defense was terrible. And it's just one of those things we have to kind of look at and just accept it for what it is and move on. And if you also want to throw in that asterisk that there was no Vasilevsky, and really Vasilevsky did not really get into the swing of things until March. By then, the season's pretty much all but over. But what I will say with Nick Paul that really was something that you love to see, and something that I love to kind of, when we get past the goals, when we get past the assists, when we get past the points, the thing that really since the inception of this podcast that I have really been using to evaluate players, whether I've said it out loud or not, has been point shares. Now, if you don't know what point shares are, this is the actual definition of Hockey Reference. It is an estimate of the number of points contributed by a player. So that's also another kind of way. I mean, I almost view it as beyond a secondary assist. And his point share happened to be 3.8 this year, which is pretty good. Pretty good. I think that when you come down to it with his game, I think really it's really understated the effect that he has on this team. And really his ability to be able to have effect on the game when he's not scoring points is a huge difference maker, I think, for this Lightning team. There was countless times this year really where even him doing the little things really helped keep the Lightning kind of above water. We've spoken about it throughout the course of this season. How, yes, Nikita Kucherov, he has really contributed a whole ton to this team and really was the driving force as to why this team was able to make the playoffs. I mean, let's face it, you know, Kuch has an average season, NHL average season, not an average Kucherov season. You know, this outcome might be looking a little different, but obviously at the same time, you know, you got to give credit where credit is due with other players on this team. And Nick Paul was one of those guys that really helped out immensely. Even when it looked like the village was burning down, Nick Paul continued to do the little things for this Tampa Bay Lightning team, whether it had been playing on the third line, sometimes playing on the second, getting time on the power play. He's one of those guys where really looking back on it, on that trade, trading away Matthew Joseph, and then also in that same breath, extending him for 7 years, paying him about $3.1 million and a half. I mean, really, if he continues to play like this, and we'll talk more about this as we talk about his future, where he lies in the Lightning's future plans. If he continues to play like this, he is really going to just... It's going to be probably one of the best signings the Lightning will have ever made in the last 20 years. And that's not recency bias. I mean, I'm sure there's other players that come to mind when you think about that. But if he continues to produce, and also at the same time, like I said, we'll get into future plans, that 3.1 and a half with the salary cap going up, that, you know, for all the flack that I give Julian Brisebois, I think that might have been one of the best deals that he has ever made, as well as the best trades. You know, we obviously talk about Barclay Goodrow, Blake Coleman back in the day, but Nick Paul, who is here in the present now, continuing to help this team win games and trying to get them back to a Stanley Cup final, really is one of the players that I think that any team in the league would be lucky enough to have Nick Paul on their team. And he's one of those guys where a lot of teams, more times than not, are looking at the trade line to acquire a player like him. So let me know. I know it was a little bit of an abbreviated looking back on his season, but listen, when you're talking about Nick Paul, I mean, he is just a Swiss Army knife. He does everything. And then just the fact that he had as many goals this year was pretty impressive, all things considered. I mean, he's very consistent. His home and away splits are pretty much identical. And at the same time, I mean, you see how much of an effect he has on this Lightning team. In games that they won, he has scored 21 goals and 39 points. In games that they lost, he had 3 goals and 7 points. So that just shows you when he's playing well, this Lightning team is playing well. So let me know in the comments below, what would you grade Nick Paul's season? Honestly, I would give it probably an A, a flat A, just because of just like the excess in offensive production. Really all season career highs for him, and really, I would really hope that we start to see more of a climb in points as the years go on, because another player, seems like he's been in the league for forever, but he's only 28, which is phenomenal. So coming up in just a little bit, we're going to talk about the Lightning's plans for him in the future. Where does he lie as the Lightning are trying to navigate back to the Stanley Cup final? All that coming up. But first, let's talk about our first sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends over at Indeed. Now, listen, there's no I in team. We all know that, the old saying, no I in team. But there is one in Indeed, and that's the hiring platform. You need to build yours. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform you could attract, interview, and hire all in one place instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills. Indeed's a powerful hiring platform that can help you do it all. Indeed does the hard work for you. Indeed shows you candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your description immediately after you post, so you can hire faster. So start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your post as Indeed.com/locked-on. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 job credit now at Indeed.com/locked-on. Indeed.com/locked-on. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Go ahead, subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button so as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified. And I'm really excited. I wanted to wait till next week to do player reviews, but I said, you know what? Screw it. Let's go ahead and do it now. Why not? But looking at Nick Paul, which I think is a great point to start off in our player reviews. We've already talked about his past. We've already talked about his present. Now let's talk about his future. Obviously, the Lightning are in a weird, I wouldn't say weird, that's probably not the right word. They're in a kind of a brief transitional phase, I would think. Probably the right way to say it. They're still in it, but they're not. They're still a team that can make the playoffs, but they're a team, obviously, that is still lacks some pieces to even get past the first round, which is very alarming. Obviously, we have a very good core here in Tampa Bay, but obviously, like all teams in the offseason, Tampa Bay Lightning need to improve. And when you look at the players on this team, and I think that, if you want to tie this in with our general manager armchair discussion, by all means, go ahead. The best way to go about it when you're discussing in the offseason, how am I going to build this team? And that's really how I went about it on my episodes. If you didn't watch that, by the way, go ahead and go back. And I was looking at the players on this team, who's essential for the future, who maybe has a couple more years before, maybe we could explore other opportunities or other possibilities of them, possibly either trading them or maybe letting them go to free agency, whatever the case may be. When I look at Nick Paul, and I think that this is not a too far out of the box kind of idea to have, when I look at Nick Paul, he is by far 100% part of this core group of Lightning players. And what I mean is the next generation. So I'm talking about Braden Point. I'm talking about Mikhail Sergachev. I'm talking about Brandon Hagel. Up until this year, I really thought Eric Chernak was part of that. I mean, we'll talk about that when his review comes up. Obviously, Andrei Vasilevsky's in that conversation. Kucherov, we could put that there. Stamkos is kind of, I would say, probably the old guard with Hedman. But the reason I put Point there and maybe not so much other players on this team that maybe I've either missed or whatever the case may be, Anthony Cirelli, yes and no. I mean, we'll save that. Esamont, still not there yet. Still has a lot to show me. And then, of course, Janot. The reason I say Paul, obviously, other than his age, is that having that time on the power play unit and getting time here and there on the second line here and there and showing that ability out on the wing at times, plus the way his game is played. It's one of those things where you're starting to see his style of game just become, if it hasn't already, such a very crucial part for teams that have aspirations of winning Stanley Cups. In years past, the Lightning kind of lacked that. Like I said before, Julian Brees-Boss a couple of years ago picks him up at the deadline, and it was probably one of the best performances we ever saw in franchise history out of a deadline acquisition. And he's only gotten better year by year. And I think that style of game, coupled with the fact that he's been here for a couple of years now, he's at the right age. The Lightning don't have to really worry about going out and getting another player like that because you have Nick Paul. You have, like I said, even though I didn't include him in the main second core of this Lightning squad, Mikey Esamont, Tanner Janot, Mitchell Chafee. I think maybe if he continues to improve, we could put him in that classification. But that's the thing. You need guys that could go out there, put points on the board around maybe 40 to 60 points per year on the board that could really play physical and not really have it slow down their game. Like I stated before, he played 82 games this year. The guy, for the most part, did not look like he missed the step at all this year throughout the course of the season. And that is something, especially because you're going to go through it throughout the course of the year when your scorers are just not scoring, when your top players are going through a funk. We saw it, case in point. I'm also bringing it up because their coach got fired today, but Toronto, I mean, perfect team to kind of look at as the opposite. They have a bunch of scorers, but they don't really have guys like a Nick Paul or who play like a Nick Paul who could go out there and kind of do a little bit of everything. I mean, they have Tyler Bertuzzi, but really what else outside of that do they really have? Nick Paul also could win faceoffs too. That's the other thing. But that's why I got to put him up there. I think that if he continues to produce, he continues to play, he continues to grow his game as, yes, I don't think players really, by the time you get to maybe 30, 31, if you're a forward, that's kind of when your growth kind of ends. And then whatever you are from that point in time, your ceiling that's your ceiling. But with Nick Paul, I could see him on the second line, barring what happens or how Cirelli plays in the next couple of years. I could see maybe Paul, if he continues, it wouldn't be the worst thing if you have Nick Paul on the first and Cirelli on the second. Obviously, the long-term goal here, or has been for the Lightning for years, has been eventually Cirelli to mold into that number one center spot. But Nick Paul, with a little bit extra scoring to his game and is able to stay on the ice a lot better and more often than Anthony Cirelli, might very well edge him out for that number one center spot, which at the end of the day, like I said, not a big deal, especially when you got Point and Kucherov playing on both sides of you. But yeah, I think he's going to be an integral part of this team. I could even see him wearing a letter in the future, not a captain's letter, of course. That's probably either going to go to Point or maybe even Cooch. Most likely, probably Point, I would imagine. But yeah, I could see him being an alternate captain at some point in the very near future. If especially this year, if Stamkos leaves in the offseason, and then most likely we might get a lot of people talking about Hedman possibly wearing the C for a year, or whatever the case may be. But yeah, I think when you're talking about this team and you're talking about building towards the future, Nick Paul is 100% a big part of that future for the Tampa Bay Lightning, especially when you have aspirations of winning a Stanley Cup. So let me know in the comments below, what are your thoughts and feelings surrounding that? And then coming up in just a little bit to wrap things up, we're talking about our expectations for the 2024-25 season for Mr. Paul. All that coming up. But first, let's talk about our last sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends over at FanDuel. Now, it's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So one last time, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. If you want to reach out to us, go ahead on our social media pages, LO_Lightning on Twitter, as well as LockedOn_Lightning on Instagram. If you want to reach out to me personally, go ahead to my Twitter account at DenkyDank, DENKYD8NK. Love hearing all from you, whether it's who do you want me to do a player review for next, or topics of conversation. And like I said, coming up this summer, you definitely don't want to miss it. We're going to do a complete watch through of the 2004 Stanley Cup playoffs for the Tampa Bay Lightning, in which, of course, we all know the end result. They win their first Stanley Cup. So go ahead and make sure to tune in for that. We're probably going to do that, I would say, probably starting in the first week of July. So make sure to tune into that then. So wrapping things up with expectations for 2024-25. And I'm going to say right off at the bat, I'm not even going to ease into it. I think we're going to have a phenomenal year from him. I think that this is where you go, especially if you don't see Stamkos coming back, which I honestly think he's coming back. I mean, I would be honestly shocked. I would be incredibly shocked if he's not in Tampa Bay next year, unless he decided to retire or whatever the case may be. But with Nick Paul, I think that we're going to see a big transition from him. We're going to go from supporting cast player, bottom six player, really more so. I mean, if you really want to get technical, he's a fringe top six, or really, top six, even though he's on the third line. That just shows you how really good he was. And, especially when Cirelli was out, he was up at the second. But I think that we might see that switch this year. I would probably bet money at this point in time that, and I know I put out my line combinations the other day for Armchair GM Talk, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if we're here in October or November, at any point throughout the course of this season, especially early on, if Cooper rolls out the lineups of Cirelli, Kucherov, and Point, and then on the second line you have Paul and Stamkos, and for that winger spot, I mean, you could really do a lot there. You could do Hagel. I mean, you could even move Stamkos down to the third and put Jeannot up, so you have a big body up there. I think, and we'll talk more about that with Jeannot on his player review, but there's a lot of people. Some Lightning fans don't realize, how really flexible this lineup's going to be, regardless of how much Cooper really likes to kind of keep things as they are, or more so stereotypical. He doesn't really like to get too outside the box with this Lightning lineup. But I think this is the year. Like I said, we will see Nick Paul really start to grow into that leadership role on the top six. I think that, the days of playing on the third line are kind of pretty much over unless he regresses this year, which I just don't see it. His game is just, it's such an easy formula for a guy like that. This isn't someone like that has to, is coming off a 50-goal season. This is a guy that's, in the 40 to 60 point range, like I said, a guy that plays physical, a guy that really does all the small things, a Swiss Army knife. And that's the kind of guy that, traditionally you want on your third line, but it's that kind of league now where the goal scorers are so much better, the skaters are so much faster, even the goaltenders are a lot better. And having a guy like that in your top six isn't a bad thing to have. And I think we'll see another 20-goal season, of course, from him. I think if he plays in the top six, we'll probably see something north of 60 points. As to what exactly that number is, I'm not going to put a value on it just yet. I mean, if we're going to be on the safe side, I think he gets up to 55. I think that's a good number to kind of strive for with him. I think we maybe see a 25 season from him. That is, like I said, it's all dependent on what Cooper decides to do with him on the line combinations. But I'm not going to go too far just yet. I want to say it, but I wouldn't be surprised if I'm not saying he's going to finish top 3, but top 10 in the Selke conversation. I think that's not too far out of the box to maybe throw out there. I mean, if you got him and Cirelli in the top 10 of the Selke conversation, the Lightning are in good shape. Obviously with Cirelli, it's kind of a whole nother ball game. Him just trying to stay healthy, but he gets some more. If Paul gets some more time on that top 6 line, and when I mean more time, permanent time, I think that really, the Lightning are putting themselves in a good spot for the future, especially with a guy who could win face-offs, a guy who could do everything, and just makes everybody on his line a lot better. So let me know who or what you would like to see out of Nick Paul this upcoming season in 24-25. Give me your predictions. How many goals? How many points? Where is he going to be in the lineup? I'm saying second line center. We're going to see a 50-goal season. A 50-point season out of him. And tomorrow, we are going to talk about Mikhail Sergachev on our next player review. So you definitely don't want to miss out on that. So go ahead, subscribe to the podcast, give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed. And you could also hit a notification button if you're listening to us or watching us on an app-based platform. So as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified. So that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.